Our speaker of the day is Rob Paratley, and we are so thankful to have him here. He is a native New Yorker, who I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, but I believe that you came from Cornell
That's right.
to the University of Kentucky, is a retired professor from the university, instructor from the University of Kentucky, but currently still runs the herbarium there. So that's the big plant collection at UK. Great resource for all things botany. So if you're here to pick someone's brain about botany, you're in the right place. And I will go ahead and turn it over to Rob and let him share his screen, and we can go ahead and get started.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm still doing my Zoom fumbling. It's been a while. Thanks for the little introduction. I am retired, but I'm still working here at the herbarium. I don't know if you can't see anything of me anymore, I guess, but the herbarium is behind me. And for those of you that don't know, it's essentially a library of collected pressed plants that serves for instruction and research, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to go on about me very much, but I will tell you all that I have a long time ago, I have some wetland background, did my graduate work in a wetland complex, but it was very different from anything we have in Kentucky. It was basically boreal, very northern in its aspect. But there are a lot of things about wetlands that general things that will hold true. So today, in the next hour or so, I'm going to talk to you about wetlands in two parts. First part, I thought it would be a good idea, and Lori helped me realize this, to talk about wetlands in general and wetland plants, how they survive and some things about them. That will probably take about half of this presentation, or perhaps a little bit more, depending on how I get going on some of this thing. So wetlands in general, which might be hopefully an interesting topic. And then in the second half, we're going to zero in on the far western part of our state, which we'll find out a little bit more later, is the region that has by far the lion's share of the state's wetlands. And I'll talk more about this later on, but let me just introduce far western Kentucky by saying that it is, for a botanist or any nature lover, it's an extremely exciting and very different part of Kentucky. In fact, when I teach a little bit about, when I used to teach a little bit about it in classes, I used to say that the far western part of the state, basically from Owensboro and land between the lakes to the edge of the state, the western edge of the state, that part of the state has much more in common botanically with Louisiana and the deep south than it does with the rest of the state. So it's a very exciting part of the state. I wish I had been able to spend more time there myself, but that could change. All right, I'm going to launch into this now. Again, first part of this is about wetlands in general. And we'll start off with something generally about wetland plants. And here's a diagram that I pulled off the internet, which shows in a schematic way some of the different sort of micro plant communities that you might find in a wetland. And we're going to go through those in two ways for the next few minutes. I'm going to go through them by sort of hydrology and water type. And then we're going to go through them as plant communities and relate them together. So you can see this series from left to right. It goes from open water to shallower and shallower water. And then I don't think I have an arrow, but that's okay. Over on the right-hand side, you can see a forested wetland, and then the upland plants, which we're not going to talk about at all particularly. So let's move on. and start with, again, I'll run through these very quickly, and most of you probably have a feeling for this. There are plants that we would call aquatic plants. They are unrooted, and they are usually drifting in open water, usually pretty near the water surface so that they can catch some light to photosynthesize. And that's them. I don't know that much about them compared to other groups, but they are an important part of any wetland complex. And again, I'm going to show you a lot of slides with a lot of pictures of a lot of plants. Don't get bogged down in the details and try to say, oh my goodness, what's ceratophyllum? What's potamogeton? What's this? What's that? If you know some of these things in these photos, swell, but it just gives you a feel for the examples of these different types. So open water, and now also in open water, we have unrooted plants that float along the surface. On the left is an invasive problematic plant called water hyacinth that just kind of goes along the surface. On the right is duckweed, which a lot of people probably think is an algae, or they call it pond scum or something like that. And in the lower right corner, you see a nice picture of how they send their roots down into the water, but they're not rooted. The next group is the one that's probably most familiar, and at least in terms of herbaceous plants. These are the emergent plants that are rooted in the muck, and then much of their plant body is above ground. Okay, and we have lots of examples of those. I'll just show you 2 slides of the many, many examples of these. There is a water lily, very familiar, nice ornamental on the left, and a group of plants called arrowhead on the right. A nice picture in the lower left of somebody pulling up the arrowroot, and you can see the rhizome or the underground stem and the roots that come off of the arrowhead there. And then I have another slide of some of these. We're not going to talk about the herbaceous plants today because we only have an hour. If you want to talk about them some other time, we can come back and do it. So I thought I'd give you another slide of some of these emergent plants. All of these 4 here are from completely different plant families. 3 of them are dicots, and one of them is in the lower right is a monocot. And again, they're rooted in the muck, and much of the above of the plant is above the water level. And here's one slide of the last category, which are the wetland woody plants, which we are going to focus on in the second part of the talk. When we get into the Western Kentucky swamps and whatnot, we'll be focusing on the woody plants, particularly the ones that are distinctive to the far western part of the state. So I don't have any examples of them here, but it is an important category. And then just this morning, I said to myself, oh, you know what they need to hear? They need to hear a little bit about how wetland plants cope with the very specialized and often difficult environment of high water tables and inundation. Okay. Superficially, one might think, well, plants need water. Lots of water has to be good. Not so. Not so. Too much water, the water table at or above the surface, can be a very difficult place for a plant. Why? Because essentially because oxygen, which plants need, especially their roots, diffuses very, very slowly in water. And basically, roots for most plants, most upland plants, will die in a wetland. They will not survive because their roots essentially can't breathe. Plants, as you probably already know, breathe not with lungs, but they metabolically breathe through respiration, very much the way animals do, almost identically to the way animals do. And if a root can't breathe, it will die. And you can see some dying roots in the lower right corner there. Yeah, lack of oxygen. There are a couple of other causes. If roots lose their fungi that help them procure water and nutrients, they can also die, and toxicity can also play a part. So inundation is not a great thing for the vast majority of plants. But wetland plants, in one way or another, have ways of dealing with this. And I've got two slides to show you that. First way is, especially for woody plants, have very shallow root systems so that when the water table is lowered, you have a chance to do that breathing and oxygen procurement. Okay, still can get water because the soils are still pretty moist. But if the water table lowers just a little bit, those very shallow roots can support the plant. Okay, other ways that some other plants, usually herbaceous plants, but a few woody plants too, they have a specialized tissue in their stems called parenchyma, which essentially just means a spongy, very open tissue that allows oxygen to be shunted down to the parts of the plant that are below water level. And again, and to get that oxygen to mostly to the roots that need it so badly. Adventitious roots is another thing that some plants do. Essentially, when all of those roots start dying and when they're inundated, the plants grow roots right above them. They keep growing roots right above them. And that's another way they can cope. I've got one more slide of that. And this is something that, I don't know, most of the books don't really talk about, but anyone who spends time in wetlands or does research, physiological research on wetland plants, they know this. And I'm talking about the slide on the right side of this, is that wetland plants are very good at basically stopping their metabolic processes and essentially waiting and shutting down until conditions below the surface are congenial for them to start growing. And this is really obvious if you spend time exploring wetlands. And if you go to a wetland, let's see, in Kentucky, that would be maybe in late March or early or to middle April. And you will notice that the wetland plants are not really doing anything. They look kind of like this slide that I found. They're just sitting there. And finally, later on in the spring, or even early summer, they start to do their thing. And they start to elongate and grow and produce their reproductive structures. What's that about? It's basically waiting a little bit until conditions are right. And in the middle of the growing season, plants will also shut down temporarily until water levels lower. And the slide on the lower left is a kind of an obvious one. Most wetland plants will send their, even submerged ones, will send their reproductive structures above the water surface so pollinators can get to them, whether it's insect pollination or in some cases wind pollination. And that's important too. Okay, now we're going to segue to a way of delineating different plant communities in wetlands generally. And again, we're talking about wetlands in our region. I'm not going to talk about northern bogs and some of the other things that I worked in a long time ago. But these slides are pertinent to our wetlands, whether it's Western Kentucky or Central or Eastern Kentucky as well. And we'll try to connect them a little bit to the plants that we just talked about. Okay, open water is obviously one kind of wetland type of plant community. And there we're going to find what we saw before, the aquatics and the floating plants. And toward the margins of the pond or the lake or even the reservoir, you might find some of the emergence in the shallower parts toward the edges. Open water. We're not going to talk about some of these today. We're going to spotlight some of the woody plant ones. Marshes, okay, these are also open habitats, very important for many, many reasons. And they are dominated, obviously, by emergent herbaceous plants. There are some spots that might have some open water in them, and you might have some submerged plants there too, but dominated basically by emergence that we looked at a little bit before. And saying hello in the upper right corner is a typical one, cattails, which you're all familiar with, I'm sure. Okay. Here's a type, another one that we're not going to talk about. It's the wet meadow. It's generally not as wet as a marsh. The water table will come only up to the surface occasionally, like in spring or after heavy rains during the growing season. But the water table is probably not that far below the surface. And here you're going to get emergent plants, particularly in the wettest spots that we just looked at. But you're also going to get a group of plants that we might just call sort of upland plants that are tolerant of some temporary flooding. And I've got a couple of examples there, Joe Pye weed and boneset, and there are many, many others. These are plants that you can often find in places that are temporarily wet. Again, we're not going to be talking about that. So that's another open wetland type. Here's a couple of interesting ones, and if we had more time, I would spend some time talking about these. These are called perched wetlands, and they're not found in low places necessarily, or along rivers or other obvious places that you might expect to see wetlands, but they're found in uplands, sometimes even on ridge tops in topographically hilly places. And what's going on here is that in localized places, some of these are very small, actually, you have very slow drainage because just below the surface, there's some kind of an imperviable, usually kind of a clay layer that might impede drainage. And you can have these very small little places that will have a very distinct flora. And some of the rare plants in our state are found in these. Interrupted fern down there at the bottom is not rare, but it might be the kind of fern you might find just popping up in one of these places as you're walking along on a ridgetop. And suddenly your feet are getting a little moist and you find this whole different, usually open place with some wetland plants. And you wonder to yourself, perhaps, how did these get here? Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion later. Here's a type that I'm also not going to talk about. It's not that common in Kentucky. It's much more common in the Southeast, but we do have a bit of this. They're called flatwoods. And this is a place, usually the topography is pretty flat, and they are quite poorly drained in the springtime, seasonally. And they have a suite of woody plants and some other herbaceous plants that are also, and probably more typically, thought of as plants of dry sites. And I put one example in the lower right corner. It's post oak. And if you know that tree, you think post oak grows in the scrappiest, driest places. But it can also be found in some of these kind of specialized places that are kind of soggy in March and April, let's say, and then get very dry in the summertime. Again, an interesting place with some interesting plants, but we're not going to talk about that either. Now the swamp forest, which I'll just introduce briefly here, because this is one of two areas of plant communities that we are going to spotlight, the swamp forest. The water table is at, or as you can see in this picture, above the surface of the muck for sometimes extended periods of time. So that's going to be the big difference between swamps and what we're going to look at next, which are called bottomland forests. The biggest difference is how long does the water table stay at or above the surface? And the plants that can adapt to swamps are really good at adapting to places that have prolonged periods of inundation. A subtype of that is a shrub swamp. In other words, shrubs might invade a place like this, and they might keep the trees out for an indefinite period of time. And again, there'll be some very specialized shrubs that would be found here. And later on, I've got one slide of examples of some of those. And the other major type that I want to focus on today, very common in Western Kentucky and other places too, are the bottomland forests. These are definitely not considered swamps. The flora, there is a little bit of overlap, but they're quite distinct from the swamp. And the environment that these trees and other plants find themselves in is actually quite different. It's quite different than a swamp. And I've got a couple of slides that talk about this. This slide has a lot of information, and it shows us that bottomland forests will be inundated for short periods of time. How short? Well, it depends on conditions, obviously, but typically the flooded condition that you see in the upper left might be happening for a week or two, or perhaps 3. It's seasonal, but it can also, the water table can also pop up again after significant precipitation events in the later part of the growing season. But as the growing season goes on here in Kentucky, things tend to get a little bit drier, and a bottomland hardwood stand might look like the lower left picture. And it would be pretty easy to walk through. It would be pretty easy to walk through. So those are very different conditions. The soil conditions are also usually quite different in a bottomland forest. They're usually nutrient-rich, very productive alluvial soils, whereas swamps have usually mucky soils that can be productive, but are often not. And then the picture on the right is just one dramatic picture of what can happen, particularly along streams and river courses when rivers overbank. It can be very dramatic and very scary. And from the plant's point of view, it can lead to a lot of disturbance. And many bottomland trees and other plants are adapted to disturbance conditions, which we won't go into today. Now I have, I think, about 3 slides about wetlands in general. And this slide just basically shows that wetlands have 3 major inputs of water into them. Precipitation, obviously, surface flow, which means usually an inflow stream that feeds into the wetland. And that's, you can see it labeled as surface inflow. And then there might also, not always, but there might also be groundwater influence as well, okay? And then there are the outputs or the outflows. There's a stream usually that's running out the other end, if you will, of a wetland. And there might be groundwater outflow too, which is not obvious to those of us walking around and exploring wetlands. And the other thing that we need to consider, and a very important outflow, is evapotranspiration. Once a wetland gets cooking metabolically, the trees and herbaceous plants are opening up their stomates to let in gases, and they're letting out copious amounts of water, particularly the trees. So evapotranspiration is a very important way of removing water from a wetland. So why does this happen? I've got this extremely silly picture at the bottom. Essentially, a wetland is, in a very superficial way, without equations, without hydrology, it's basically a bathtub where the drain part of it, the groundwater outflow, certainly the surface outflow, are very sluggish and impeded. And the inflows, especially during precipitation events, are going steadily. So the rate of input at those times is far greater than the sluggish drainage of them. So that's essentially, in a very simplistic way, what a wetland is. Okay, here's a picture that shows, the above picture shows fluctuating wetlands, which is actually, I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but actually fluctuating water surface, the water level is actually the most important way of understanding why you have the type of plant communities that you have, whether it's open water, whether it's an emergent marsh, whether it's a forested swamp, how frequently and how high and for how long the surface of the water stays above the surface of the ground is probably the most important factor in describing which kind of wetland plant community you'll find. Okay, and again, we went through them all, and we're going to talk about the swamps, and we're going to talk about the bottomland hardwood. So keep this fluctuating water levels in mind. The graph at the bottom, it's not really appropriate to our region, but it does show that water tables can be quite fluctuating by season. And that's kind of the idea there. And wetlands, I wish I could have found a better picture of this, but wetlands are spatially very complex. What do I mean by that? I mean, several of the wetland types that I showed you before can often be found coexisting in a matrix in one area. And at the end, if I have time, I'm going to show you some pictures of some Western Kentucky preserves that preserve wetlands. And you can be sure that many of the different wetland habitats will be found within some of these preserves, even some of the very small ones. And again, it's based on very small changes in topography. And I mean, it's almost hard to see them or perceive them, but changes of even just a foot or two can change the fluctuating water tables, can change which plant communities are going to be found. So they're often found side by side based on small topographic changes. Now, let me look at the time to make sure where we are here. Oh, that's not bad. It's 11:30. So now we're going to switch to, we're not going to talk about wetlands in general anymore. We're going to talk about the far western part of the state. And we have a map in the upper left of the different physiographic regions of the state, which many of you have seen in other courses and presentations. We're going to focus on two of them. Why? Because those two, the Western Kentucky Coalfield or the Shawnee Hills, which you'll see 2 slides from now, and the far western parts, the Mississippi Embayment or the Jackson Purchase, those 2 places have the preponderance of the wetlands in our state. And as we'll see in a moment, not only do they have the preponderance of the wetlands in our state, but they also have the most distinctive wetlands in the state. As I mentioned in, I think, the very beginning of this, these places, these communities in this part of the state have much more in common with Louisiana than they do with Louisville or Lexington or the eastern parts of Kentucky. And we'll see that, at least with the forested wetlands. So let's take a look now at a slide that shows the far western part of the state. Maybe a few people that are listening in on this, maybe on the recording, because they're an hour different from us, are looking in from this part of the state. Hello to you guys. It's very possible that you know more about these wetlands because you live there than I do, because I've only had the occasion to visit this part of the state a few times and hope to get back there again because it is so interesting. The Mississippi Embayment is essentially the confluence of the Ohio River and the Mississippi River and some other important creeks like Obion Creek and a few others. And the topography is pretty rolling, and there are a lot of poorly drained places, as we'll see a little bit later on, not as many as there used to be. Okay, that's the Mississippi Embayment. And the other spotlight is on the Shawnee Hills or the Western Coalfield. Geologically, as you can see in the upper line drawing of Kentucky, geologically, the Shawnee Hills is very similar to Eastern Kentucky, the Cumberland Plateau. It has very, very similar rock types, but it's not nearly as rugged. And it has much more, many more areas of sluggish drainage. You can kind of see that, I hope, in the lower left, a little portion of Kentucky. And I believe that was from a geological map. And you can see that yellow there from Owensboro, all that yellow, all of that is, it's a geological map. And all of that is very recent alluvial deposits, which suggests to us that there were a lot of wetlands in that part of the state. So those are the two areas that we're going to say hello to today. There may be some people on this call or we'll watch it later from that region of the state as well. Okay, here's a couple of slides that bring home the point that I've been trying to make, that this part of the state is more like the southeastern bottomlands, as I keep mentioning Louisiana. But you can see on this map that there are several basic broad plant community types in the southeast. And we're not going to go through the other four particularly, but I circled bottomland hardwoods. And it's that, I don't know, you call it bluish green color. And you can see all throughout the southeast, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but all along the southeast, along all of the major river systems are bottomland hardwood systems and swamp forests. We're going to look at both of them in that area. They're just calling this whole thing bottomland hardwood. And then you can see a major distinctive region of bottomlands and swamps that runs along the Mississippi River up into that far western part of the state, and then up into Illinois some, and perhaps into Indiana a little bit as well. So this is a slide that shows you that the trees and shrubs that we're going to look at are tied to the deep south rather than to the rest of Kentucky, which makes them, from a naturalist's or a botanist's point of view, extremely interesting, and an extremely interesting part of the natural heritage of Kentucky. Here's a slide. Again, don't get caught up in the details here, but I pulled, this was from my dendrology course, I pulled 4 of the trees that we're going to meet and greet in just a minute. And I put up their range maps up there next to them, overcup oak and pecan and water tupelo and bald cypress. All of the, we're going to meet them all and you in a moment, and you can see that they all have slightly different ranges, but there's a big similarity to them. And as far as Kentucky is concerned, you can see that they're only found in the parts of Kentucky that we're spotlighting in this program. Okay, so all of these trees are not found unless somebody plants them, like a pecan or a bald cypress. They can be planted in other parts of the state, but they're not found in other parts. Again, it makes this a very interesting part of the state from a natural history perspective. So here's our swamps, and we're going to look at some of the trees that are found in these swamps. The first one is probably the classic. And maybe when you think of a deep southeastern swamp forest, the first thing that might come to mind is bald cypress. And this is what they look like when the water table is above the surface of the muck. And it can be above the surface of the muck for a long time. We are not talking about 2 or 3 weeks here, like we'll see in the bottomland forests. We are talking perhaps sometimes all through the growing season, and sometimes for more than a year. Typically, they might draw down, that's what it's called, drawdown. They might draw down in late summer and into the fall, and then you can actually walk around in these. But at other times, you'd better be in a kayak or a canoe if you want to explore these places. And again, bald cypress, here's a little spotlight on it. Bald, that's what the foliage and the cones look like. It's a deciduous conifer, a little unusual. And I believe that its deciduousness is part of the way it adapts to the high water levels. The other thing that we could notice, again, we can't spend a lot of time on each one of these trees, but when bald cypress grows in an inundated situation, it will produce what are called these knees. Again, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but right next to this tree in the upper left, there are all these sort of knobby things that look like stalagmites in a cavern. And those are part of the root system. And it took a long time for plant physiologists to try to prove what these things do. But apparently they have a role in bringing oxygen down to the roots that are in the inundated portion of the plant body. So bald cypress is an interesting tree. It can, of course, be grown horticulturally in uplands. It'll grow just fine, but it is specialized for those really deep swamps. Interestingly enough, it will not reproduce in high water. It requires to germinate and to produce its seedlings, it requires drawdown. So it will only send up its seedlings in times when the muck is exposed. Here's a slide that brings home the Louisiana point. No, we don't have alligators yet, but who knows in the future. Here's another type that you'll find in far western Kentucky, particularly in the Mississippi embayment, are the water tupelo swamps. And sometimes water tupelo will grow mixed in with bald cypress, and they'll grow together. Sometimes the two trees grow separately, but these are the two trees that grow in the deepest swamps with the most prolonged high water table. But again, this picture, excuse me, looks like it's was taken at a time when the water table is drawing down a little bit, and you might be able to muck around in there a little bit. Water tupelo is related to the more well-known black gum, but its leaves are quite a bit larger, and the fruit is also larger as well. Otherwise, it's fairly similar, but it's adapted to a much different environment. Okay, here are some other trees that a botanist or a nature lover will thrill to see in far western Kentucky swamps, because these trees, there's two in this slide, and then I think there's two or three in the next slide, only grow in that western part of the state. Remember those range maps I showed you? In the lower right is water locust, a close cousin of the more familiar not black locust, but honey locust. It's very closely related to honey locust. The big difference is in the little insect picture, which is right here, if you can see my cursor. And that is the fruit, is actually the best way to tell the two apart. The fruit of water locust only has one seed, and it's really pretty small. It's only an inch or an inch plus long, whereas honey locust has a much larger mini-seeded fruit. Otherwise, it's thorny, and its leaves are pretty similar to honey locust. In the upper left is a tree that I don't know very well called pumpkin ash. And again, it can grow in pretty deep swamps. It certainly looks like an ash, and it's closely related to green ash and to white ash. Its fruit is a lot larger and a lot wider than the fruit of some of the more familiar ashes. And here are three more trees that you just will not find in the rest of Kentucky in any of its wetlands. You have to go pretty much to the far part of the state to see water elm, which is not an elm per se, but it's in the elm family. And its fruit in the lower left there is very different from elm fruit. Elm fruit looks like a kind of like a papery coin-like wafer. And water elm has this kind of knobby looking nut. And there you can see it growing in a swamp. The bark is also quite different from its cousins, the elm. In the upper right is the swamp cottonwood, again, only found in the far western part of the state. Its leaves are longer and very differently shaped from the more well-known eastern cottonwood. but the fruit, the cottony seeds are very much the same. In the lower right is a tree called swamp hickory. It's pretty closely related to pecan, actually, but it has fewer leaflets and its fruit is kind of squashed. If any of you come with me to the Arboretum tour, the Arboretum does have a swamp hickory, and we can try to take a look at that. Here are just some shrubs that grow in far western Kentucky swamps, usually on places that are maybe a little bit more mounded up in some of those swamps. I'm not going to go over these in detail. Some of these are found in the UK Arboretum, and we might be able to take a look at some of them. Okay, the other type, checking the time here, this is good. The other type is the bottomland hardwoods that are also found in this part of the state. And I'm going to focus on the trees and a few shrubs that, once again, you will have to travel to the Shawnee Hills wetlands or the Mississippi embayment wetlands to see these trees. So again, what is a bottomland hardwood? Some of them are associated with major streams and major rivers. But most importantly, the most important difference is that their periods of inundation are quite temporary, and the soil is usually quite productive. In fact, in Kentucky and in parts of the Southeast that have bottomland hardwoods, foresters manage bottomland hardwoods for timber and pulp and paper. Very important because the soils are so productive in most bottomland hardwoods, the trees grow very well and they grow very quickly. And I've got a slide of that later on. So bottomland hardwoods are important economically. And it's not that swamp forests are not, but bottomland forests are major economic players in the southeastern forests. Here are two swamp oaks, bottomland oaks, that are again found in the western part of the state. You might be familiar with them because most of these two and the three on the next slide, they're all oaks, can be planted in our parks and in our arboreta and even as street trees. Many of them do very well. In fact, I'm starting to see overcup oak planted in some places that are not in places with inundated heavy soils. But they can be planted in urban situations. Overcup oak is easily known when it comes to fruit. It's got an acorn where the cap almost completely covers the nut. Very distinctive. Swamp chestnut oak is a little harder to pick out from some of its near cousin twins, but it's best known probably by its very large acorn. It's got a very large acorn compared to some of the other oaks that have leaves that look like that, like chestnut oak or chinkapin oak. Here are three more Western Kentucky bottomland oaks. And again, these are important timber trees in certain situations. They grow straight, they grow fast, and they grow tall. And the wood is usually pretty highly valued. On the upper left is cherry bark oak, which is a very close cousin of southern red oak. In fact, in the old days, they thought that this was a variety of southern red oak, but now it's considered a distinctive species, and I agree with that. It grows very differently. Water oak, again, you see this planted as a street and park tree around. It's easily known by its very small, kind of oddly shaped, almost like a spatula-shaped leaf. And willow oak is also distinctive because you look at it and you think, that doesn't look like an oak at all, but it will produce, what's in the lower part of the picture, it will produce acorns just like the other two. In fact, all three of these are pretty closely related oaks. Here are some other distinctive bottomland trees of the far western part of our state. In the upper left is sugarberry, which is a celtis, which means it's closely related to the more commonly known common hackberry. It's separated from common hackberry by its leaves, which usually are smaller and not as toothed as common hackberry. And the fruit is a slightly different color as well. In the lower right is probably the most important bottomland tree of all, which is pecan, which is not only an important timber tree, but obviously it's also an orchard tree throughout the Southeast, harvested for its pecans. In the upper right is a deciduous holly, which is distinctive of the far western part of the state. And it's not an easy tree to know. It's a small tree, but when it produces its red drupes, then you think, oh, maybe that is a holly after all. Here are some other trees that are found in our swamps of Western Kentucky, but these are, I'll just go through them very quickly because they're probably familiar to you. These are bottomland trees that are found essentially throughout the state. And in the case of sycamore, it's found throughout most of eastern United States, in stream banks, river bottoms, and bottomlands in general. But these widely found trees are also important constituents of the bottomland forests that we've been talking about. There is green ash, which is hard to separate from white ash. You have to look closely at the fruit and at the twigs to do it. River birch is pretty distinctive. Again, you'll find these in many parts of the state. And here are a couple of maples that are also found in bottomlands all throughout the state. Well, we give them a little shout out in this one slide. On the right is box elder, a kind of a weedy maple that grows in wetlands, and silver maple, which usually is found only along pretty major stream courses, right on the banks or right on what's called the first terrace of those. They're both maples. And this is the last slide of the widely found trees. This is red maple, which many of you may know as an upland tree. It grows in pretty dry, pretty unproductive soils in many parts of the state. Not so much on limestone. I hardly ever see it on limestone, but it's widely found. But there is a variety or a subspecies of red maple that grows in poorly drained places, like in Western Kentucky or in other parts of Kentucky too. And interestingly enough, look at the picture next to the picture of the tree, where you have the two leaves. The bottomland swampy version of red maple, move my cursor in case you can see it. The swampy part, subspecies of red maple has a slightly different leaf. And this is often the red maple that you find grown as street trees and park trees in our urban settings, is the bottomland one, because it does better in the compacted, heavier soils of urban situations. But you can often tell from a specimen which it is by the number of lobes, essentially, in the red maple. In the lower part of the slide is black gum, not a related tree. It's related, of course, to water tupelo that I showed you a few slides ago. This is a more commonly known tree. And once again, like the unrelated red maple, there are two pretty distinct subspecies of black gum. One, the one on the left, is the bottomland type, which has a kind of a thicker, shinier, more leathery leaf. And then there's the upland black gum that you see in the slopes and the ridge tops, mostly in eastern Kentucky, which has a thinner leaf and it's also slightly differently shaped. And it's pretty easy to tell the two apart. Like red maple, the swampy version of black gum is usually the ones that horticulturalists grow and select for our urban situations. And here are just some widely found shrubs that are also important in Western Kentucky bottomlands. Buttonbush is a favorite of mine. That can grow in swamps. That can grow in inundated swamps. The others, like chokeberry and winterberry, they won't grow in deep swamps, but in pretty poorly drained places. Okay, now the last part of this, if we have a couple of minutes, we don't have much time. I wanted to just show you some slides about what's happened to wetlands since settlement by Euro-Americans. The upper picture of Kentucky shows the land cover before settlement, and then the bottom one shows how markedly changed Kentucky and most of the eastern United States is once people began to establish settlements and farm and pasture, et cetera, spotlighting wetlands. We'll do this quickly. People have drained wetlands in Kentucky and elsewhere for agricultural fields and for pasture land. They've manipulated streams, they've dammed streams, they've made reservoirs, and all of these have impacted the wetlands of our state. A few gee whiz facts. Apparently, our state once had 1.6 million acres of wetlands, depending on how wetlands were defined. And nowadays, it has what sounds like a lot, but much less, 300,000 acres of wetlands left, mostly because of this draining and channelizing and turning things into soybean fields and pasture, and sometimes even urban sprawl, which I didn't show a picture of. So Kentucky, since settlement by Euro-Americans, has lost about 80% of its wetlands. Okay, here's another reason why natural plant communities and wetlands, the ones I've been spotlighting for this whole hour, have been lost, is because some of them have been turned into essentially tree farms, bottomland hardwood tree farms. I'll say it again. Some of these places are economically very important, pulp and paper, and even soft timber. On the right there, it looks like cottonwood. On the left, I'm not sure what those trees are. But again, bottomland tree farms and paper mills, et cetera. On an upside, so we don't get too depressed, there are efforts to restore and mitigate wetlands. Apparently, the regulations for this, the laws governing this are very complicated. Lots of agencies come into play. Down at the bottom, I just threw in some federal agencies that have a say on wetland legality and what to do with them, what you can and can't do with them. Apparently, there are a lot of loopholes, and apparently mitigation doesn't always end up looking like that bottom picture. Sometimes it does, depending on the group that's doing it. Sometimes somebody's just going to put in, sadly, just a farm pond, call it a wetland, and it really won't be anything resembling what we have looked at. Sometimes, particularly the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, the Nature Conservancy, and some of the land trusts will preserve and attempt to restore wetlands to something like what they may have been before. Last couple of slides, these are just fun slides, and I'm basically done, is that some of those agencies, let me go back one slide. Some of these agencies, the Fish and Wildlife Resources, Division of Forestry, and the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves, and some of the land trusts have created, and I've got the ones in Western Kentucky to show you, have created preserves that preserve to the best extent some of the ways that these preserves were probably found before settlement. So some of them are large, and these are usually wildlife management areas. They're not small. This particular one is 11,000 acres, and I've never been there, but I guarantee you it has many of the plant community types that I've showed you, and most of the trees and shrubs and other plants and animals, which we haven't mentioned, right? Wildlife management areas are managed for animal habitat, which we haven't talked about, of course. But these are places where one can experience some of these things that we've been looking at today. I can show you a couple of others, and then we'll stop and see if there's any feedback. But in general, the wildlife management areas are larger and there's often multi-use legality to them, and they have public access. In contrast, the upper left is a wildlife management area of some size, 4,000 acres, and embedded in it is a Kentucky State Nature Preserve. The nature preserves in the state, in this part of the state, are small. This one's 175 acres, and they are not public access. Only people with research permits, and occasionally there'll be a guided public exploration by the Office of Kentucky Nature Preserves. So that these preserves are not public access. Let me show you just one or two more. This is the Ballard Wildlife Management. Again, all of these are in the far western part of the state, and all of them have most of the wetland types that we've talked about. This is the last one I'll show you. There's another wildlife refuge. This is a national wildlife refuge, the Clarks River National Wildlife Refuge. So National Fish and Wildlife is involved there. Metropolitan Lake, which is one of the ones that I have actually visited, is a very small one, practically in Paducah. If any of you are listening in on this from Paducah, most of you have probably visited Metropolis Lake. Anyway, that's pretty much all I've got. I'm going to, what do I do now?
Well, thank you, first of all.
Okay.
That was so fascinating. I felt like I was on a journey to Western Kentucky without even having to go anywhere. And you actually answered. I had a couple questions from our folks who did not make it for the live, and you actually answered them in the course of your presentation. So I'm hoping that those folks, you know, were able to get the answers they were looking for, and they can certainly reach out to me or whoever. I'm happy to reach out to Rob and get clarification if there's any clarification that you need.
Yeah, they could reach out to me.
Yeah,
for sure.
For sure. Yes, I would be very happy to put you in touch with Rob and get those questions answered really quickly. And you mentioned it briefly, Rob, in the course of the presentation. But our guest speaker today will be leading a walk at the University of Kentucky Arboretum in Lexington that will be exploring the Western Kentucky Mississippi embayment area that we've talked about today, some of these similar plants that we've talked about today, by exploring the Walk Through Kentucky like trail system that they have at the Arboretum. So I highly recommend, if you're in the Lexington area, you can kind of get your Western Kentucky fix without, you know, going as far by joining Rob on that.
We won't get wet.
Yes, and you'll stay dry unless it's like the precipitation.
Right.
Yeah, you'll stay dry.
Well, we won't see swamps, but we'll see the plants.
Yes. So a great opportunity to follow up on this presentation, like in person with Rob. And then if you can't make it to that, I know there's a small fee attached to it, I believe, that goes to support you know, the Arboretum, which of course is great. They also have, I put the link in the chat as well. They also have, you can go on your own. I believe it's in an open portion of the Arboretum, and explore that area on your own. And there's some, you know, interpretive material and that kind of thing. You won't have the benefit of having Rob there leading the group. But if you can't make it on that day and you are in Central Kentucky but want to get familiar with some of these Western Kentucky species, then I highly recommend that you head to the Arboretum and check that out.
Yeah.
I know that we're coming up on our time here, so I do want to just say again, thank you so much, Rob. I think that we got our questions answered, but again, if you have anything else that you're thinking about it after the fact, or maybe you're watching this on the recording and you have some questions, please let me know. I would be happy to put you in touch with Rob and get those questions answered. And other than that, I hope that everyone has a lovely rest of your Friday. And thanks again, Rob, for joining us today.
Well,
we were really
thanks for listening and looking, everybody.
For sure.
Hope you enjoyed the pictures.
Oh, and beautiful. Yes, beautiful, beautiful pictures. I love a good swamp, and these were just Absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous presentation. So
Okay.
thank you so much. We appreciate you.
Okay, bye, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you later.